Well, good evening, visitors. Welcome to the Australian War Memorial's last post ceremony, which today marks the commencement of the sitting year for the 45th Parliament of Australia. My name is Richard Cruz, and joining us today from the Royal Australian Navy is Captain Lisa Batchelor. We're honoured to acknowledge the Honourable Malcolm Turnbull, Prime Minister of Australia, and Miss Lucy Turnbull. The Honourable Tony Smith, Speaker of the House of Representatives. Senator the Honourable Scott Ryan, President of the Senate. The Honourable Bill Shorten, Leader of the Federal Opposition. Vice Admiral Ray Griggs, Vice Chief of Defence Force, representing Air Chief Marshal Mark Binskin, Chief of Defence Force. Senator the Honourable Maurice Payne, Minister for Defence. The Honourable Richard Marles, Shadow Minister for Defence. The Honourable Christopher Pyne, Minister for Defence Industry. The Honourable Michael McCormack, Minister for Veterans Affairs. The Honourable Amanda Rishworth, Shadow Minister for Veterans Affairs. Mr Robert Dick, National President of the Returned and Services League of Australia. Rear Admiral Ken Doolan and Brigadier Alison Cray, representing the Chairman and the Council of the Australian War Memorial. And Dr Brendan Nelson, Director of the Australian War Memorial. We also warmly welcome all members and senators of the 45th Parliament of Australia and members of the Australian Defence Force. We're also honoured to welcome Lieutenant General Paul Winnick, Commander of the Canadian Army, Canada, and Vice Admiral Denis Barrault, Deputy Chief of Navy, France. Australia's Federation Guard is a tri-service ceremonial unit of the Australian Defence Force. They provide a ceremonial presence at civil and military events and during visits to Australia by foreign dignitaries. The Guard will now dismount the catapult party from the tomb of the unknown Australian soldier. Today marks the commencement of the sitting year for the 45th Parliament of Australia. We pause here in the commemorative area of the Australian War Memorial, repository of our nation's soul. Here we honour the 2 million men and women who wear and have worn the uniform of the Royal Australian Navy, the Australian Army and the Royal Australian Air Force. As with every day, we gather at this time for the last post ceremony. We do so in renewed commitment to one another, our nation and the ideals of mankind. We reflect on the political, economic and religious freedoms given us as Australians. At times, these freedoms have come at a great cost to our nation, the Australian Defence Force, and to the families who love and support them. At the opposite end of Anzac Parade from the Parliament, this institution and the stories it tells reminds us that we are Australians, and there are some truths by which we live. Here with us today are the men and women elected by Australians to make the decisions that build and protect our nation, including the deployment of members of the Australian Defence Force across the globe, in our uniform, under our flag and in our name. These decisions are not made lightly. The roll of honour cloaking us reminds us of the cost of those decisions, as does the physical and emotional toll on those who have served in conflicts, on operations and as peacekeepers. Our nation will pause this year to reflect on Australia's fighting on the Western Front, including the bloody battles of Dernancourt, Villers-Bretonneux, Hamel, Amiens and Damascus. So too, we will commemorate the 50th anniversaries of the attack on fire support bases, Coral and Balmoral, and the 75th anniversary of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. This year, we will mark the centenary of the armistice, when our young nation emerged from the First World War, victorious but inconsolably mourning its 62,000 dead. These events changed our nation, giving us a greater belief in ourselves and a deeper understanding of what it means to be Australian. Today, as the members of the 45th Parliament commence the sitting year, your presence here speaks to every Australian, whether by birth or choice, of the deep responsibility to never forget individual sacrifices made in our name, devotion to duty and our country. This is a place not of war, but of love and friendship, love for friends and between friends, love of family and of our country, of lives committed not to themselves, but to us, and their last moments to one another. For we are young and we are free. I would now like to invite the Prime Minister of Australia, the Honourable Malcolm Turnbull, to the lectern.
Yungu Galanyin Nalawiri, Daniyi Nanawal Dara, Wangara Lin Jin Yin, Maran Balan Wagarabang. We're gathered here today on the land of the Ngunnawal people, and we honour their elders, past and present. Speaker Tony Smith, President of the Senate Scott Ryan, Ministers, Leader of the Opposition, Dr Brendan Nelson, Defence Chiefs, Rear Admiral Ken Doolan, Brigadier Alison Cray, servicemen and women, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome also to Vice Admiral Denis Barrot, the Deputy Chief of the French Navy, and Lieutenant General Paul Winnick, the Commander of the Canadian Army. Australians, Canadians and Frenchmen were serving side by side 100 years ago in the trenches in France and Flanders in the First World War. most notably in the Battle of Amiens, as they do today, serving together in the Middle East in the coalition effort to defeat Daesh. Today, Parliament House is once again alive with the sound of democracy in full flight. And that's not a silent L. In full flight, but not a fight, as politicians from around the country return to Canberra for another year. But we never forget that everything we do across the lake, the right to legislate for our nation, to debate, discuss and decide our destiny, we owe to all of those who are honoured here. The Australian War Memorial's quiet presence reminds us that these freedoms and the values that we cherish today and preserve for future generations have come at a very high price and have come from the sacrifice of so many. It's a high price paid for our freedoms, a high price paid in young lives lost far from home. And you know, when the doors of the Parliament are flung open, from the very cabinet room itself, you look through the Parliament at the War Memorial, a constant reminder of how hard fought and hard won those freedoms that we exercise there have been. Our military history stretches across an epic canvas, a picture of selflessness, courage, love of country. And it's only within each brushstroke that the personal cost of such sacrifice is revealed. It's there in the diary entries, the letters home, the keepsakes carried from the front. And it's in all the lost stories, the unfinished chapters of all our lost men and women, in the empty chair at the table, the missing face from the family picture. Every night, the last post ceremony tells the story of just one of our fallen, and in doing so, we shine a light on another brushstroke in our nation's history. This evening, we remember Corporal John Arthur Metson, born a century ago. He was just 21 in 1940 when he volunteered for the 2nd AIF, 2nd Australian Imperial Force. He served with the 2nd 14th Battalion in Egypt, Syria and Lebanon, and during a short stint back in Australia married his sweetheart Betty. They farewelled each other for the last time when John set sail for New Guinea as part of the hard-fought effort to hold back the determined Japanese advance on Port Moresby. He was bound for the Kokoda track. Within days of their arrival, his battalion was engaged in brutal fighting. John's ankle was shattered by a bullet. A withdrawal was ordered, but during the retreat, John refused to be carried. And so, on padded hands and padded knees and in silent agony, he crawled for nearly 3 weeks through a 7,000-foot mountain range. The wounded stopped to rest at Sengay in the care of local villagers. All were later killed. John Metson was just 24. He was his parents' only child. He was posthumously awarded the British Empire Medal for courage, tenacity and unselfishness. His is one story, one life lost, but more than 102,000 names surround us, and by telling their stories, we honour their service and we remember them. We do not glorify war. We commemorate the triumph of the human spirit, the patriotism, the sacrifice, the courage and the endurance. This year, we are marking the centenary of the final year of the First World War, the war to end all wars. Those values have been present in every conflict since, and it is with the same spirit, the same values embodied by today's Anzacs who defend our freedom both here and abroad today. We know that the best way to honour the diggers of a century ago is by supporting the servicemen and women, the veterans and their families of today. And so all of us here assembled are committed to do that. And we, our nation's leaders, are reminded here today, as we are every day, that there is no more solemn responsibility than to send Australians into harm's way, and no greater responsibility than to ensure they are well led and well equipped so they can return home safely to their families. Mission accomplished, duty done, lest we forget.
Thank you, Prime Minister. I'd now like to invite the Leader of the Federal Opposition, the Honourable Bill Shorten.
Good evening, everybody. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, and I pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. In particular, I acknowledge all the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who served Australia with skill and courage long before Australia served them with justice and equality. Prime Minister, parliamentary colleagues, distinguished guests, one and all, my fellow Australians. This last post ceremony is held every night of the year except for Christmas Day. But today is an important last post, because when John Curtin opened this sacred place on Remembrance Day, 1941, he said, "The Parliament of a free people will be inspired and strengthened in the performance of its duty by the ever-present opportunity to contemplate the story that has gone before them, the deeds that helped to make a nation, and the unifying purpose which links the ordered ways of a free people with the matchless courage which inspires its sons and daughters to maintain it." When Curtin spoke these words here in 1941, in the audience were 18 Australians who'd won the Victoria Cross in the First World War. Men awarded the highest honour for the greatest valour in what they were told would be the war to end all wars. Standing where we stand now, these 18 and many other returned servicemen from the First World War, they would have had the horrors of battle etched in their mind, their fallen brothers held in their hearts. But in 1941, the fragile peace that so many had fought for had already been shattered by a second devastating global conflict. At the very moment that this memorial was being dedicated, a new generation, the children of these veterans, were risking and losing their lives in the defence of Australia. So from its very first day, the Australian War Memorial has served to honour both the heroes of the past and the courage of the present. And today, as representatives of the Australian people, we gather to fulfil this tradition. Now in 2018, there is no one left amongst us to speak for the Australians who answered their country's call 100 years ago. No one who stood in the mud and the blood of the Western Front. No one who heard the thundering hooves of Beersheba or ran through the hail of gunfire at Anzac Cove. No one who was left to grow old. Yet the names and deeds recorded in the very walls around us and in hundreds of humble memorials around our continent have not faded. It doesn't matter if it's in a small country town or this most remarkable memorial. The names we read reach out to a modern Australia with a weight and a meaning and a truth that defies the passage of the years. Every generation of service is added to the story in the finest traditions of Anzac and Australia. Loyalty, bravery, good humour in adversity, solidarity in hardship. The qualities which have withstood the sternest test and shone through the darkest hours. In the Pacific and the Mediterranean, New Guinea and North Africa, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq and Afghanistan, on land, in the air and by sea. So today and every day, we salute all those who have worn our nation's uniform. We say thank you to their families for their service, for a love and a sacrifice which often goes unseen. And as we return to Parliament for another year, trusted with the privilege of representing the people of Australia, let us promise to do better when it comes to living up to the best traditions of our nation. Let all of us who serve in the Parliament of a free people promise to do better when it comes to caring for the brave sons and daughters who have kept Australia free. And let all of us do better to honour our nation's oldest promise. We will remember them, lest we forget.
Thank you, Mr. Shorten. As always, but particularly today, we welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that support them. We acknowledge the members of RSL Services Clubs Association, RSL Victoria and RSL Queensland, who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony around Australia. I now invite you all to please stand and join in singing the national anthem. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through to the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight we'll read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 102,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and operations over more than a century. But first, we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths or floral tributes will be laid at the base of the pool of reflection in the following order. The Honourable Malcolm Turnbull, Prime Minister of Australia, and the Honourable Bill Shorten, Leader of the Federal Opposition. The Honourable Tony Smith, Speaker of the House of Representatives, and Senator the Honourable Scott Ryan, President of the Senate. Vice Admiral Ray Griggs, Vice Chief of the Defence Force, representing Chief of Defence Force. Senator the Honourable Maurice Payne, Minister for Defence, and the Honourable Richard Miles, Shadow Minister for Defence. The Honourable Michael McCormack, Minister for Veterans Affairs, and the Honourable Amanda Rishworth, Shadow Minister for Veterans Affairs. The Honourable Christopher Pyne, Minister for Defence Industry. Mr Robert Dick, National President of the Return and Services League of Australia. Rear Admiral Michael Noonan, Deputy Chief of Navy Australia, and Vice Admiral Dennis Baror, Deputy Chief of Navy France. Rear Admiral Ken Doolan, Brigadier Alison Cray, representing the Chairman and the Council of the Australian War Memorial, and Dr Brendan Nelson, Director of the Australian War Memorial. Our final wreaths this evening will be laid by visitors to the memorial.
Today, we remember and pay tribute to Corporal John Arthur Metson. John Metson was born on the 1st of August 1918 to George and Margaret Metson of the inner Melbourne suburb of Richmond. After finishing his schooling, Metson found work as a salesman and paraded part-time with the 5th Battalion of the Victorian Scottish Regiment. Following the outbreak of the Second World War, the battalion was called up for a 3-month period of compulsory training. While some members would be sent to Western Australia and Darwin to carry out garrison duties, the 21-year-old Metson instead volunteered for overseas service, enlisting in the 2nd Australian Imperial Force in May of 1940. He was posted to the newly raised 2nd 14th Battalion, and after a period of training at Puckapunyal, he left Sydney in October, bound for the Middle East. After further training in Palestine in early April 1941, the 2nd 14th Battalion moved to Egypt to help bolster defences along the Libyan frontier. In late May, it returned to Palestine to prepare for the invasion of Syria and Lebanon. The 2nd 14th launched operations in Lebanon, attacking Vichy French frontier outposts in the early hours of the 8th of June. After taking part in the drive along the coast and fighting major engagements along the Zarani River and inland at Jazin and Damour, it remained as part of the garrison until early January 1942. Sailing from Egypt at the end of January, the 2nd 14th had a brief period of respite back home. Metson took advantage of this break, marrying his sweetheart Dorothy on the 17th of April. A few months later, he was back in action as his battalion was sent to New Guinea to stem the Japanese overland advance on Port Moresby. Metson had been promoted to acting corporal and then confirmed in that rank before arriving in Port Moresby in mid-August. Within a few days, he and the other men of the 2nd 14th were advancing along the Kokoda Trail to confront the rapidly advancing Japanese. Their first clash with the enemy took place on the 26th of August. After 4 days of fighting, the Japanese broke through the Australian defence line near the village of Isaraba. Corporal Metson's ankle had been smashed by a bullet during the fighting, and he was part of a group that had been cut off from withdrawal. Looking for a way to rejoin the battalion, they fell in with a larger party under the command of Captain Buckler, which had similarly been cut off. The group included a number of wounded, some of whom, like Metson, were unable to walk. Stretchers to carry the wounded were constructed from bush poles and vines, each requiring 8 men, already loaded down with their own equipment and weapons to carry. Knowing that the group was too weak to carry more stretchers, Metson refused to be carried. Instead, he padded his hands and knees and crawled behind the stretcher bearers. As the Japanese now held the main track, the group was forced to turn off the track, wandering through the jungle for 3 weeks, searching for an alternate route. Metson spent this entire period crawling in agony. His cheerful fortitude, however, profoundly inspired the other men in the party. But they were desperately short of food and getting weaker each day, and soon became apparent that carrying the stretchers was slowing down the party's movements to the point that if they were to continue, nobody would survive. Captain Buckler decided that the seriously wounded cases would be left in the care of the villagers of Sangai so that the able-bodied could find help. A stretcher bearer, Corporal Tom Fletcher, volunteered to stay at Sangai to care for Metson and the other wounded. Immediately on his arrival at Port Moresby, Captain Bucker arranged for an American bomber to drop medical supplies and food to the men at Sangai. Although exhausted, he insisted on accompanying the crew on the flight. As the aircraft flew low over Sangai, Buckler expected to see a signal from the men who had been left there, but nothing moved on the ground below. The village appeared to be deserted. A month later, when the tide of battle had turned, a ground patrol went to the village and found the bodies of John Metson, Tom Fletcher, and the other sick and wounded, who had been discovered by the Japanese and executed. Captain Buckler never forgot Metson's courage, tenacity, and unselfishness, and saw to it that he was posthumously awarded a British Empire Medal. John Metson was buried at Sangai on the 5th of November 1942, but after the war, his remains were reinterred at Port Moresby, Bamana War Cemetery. He was 24 years old. As his mate, Les Cook, and Kokoda veteran of the 2nd 14th, wrote of him 20 years ago, "When you stand in silent remembrance on Anzac Day, or significant anniversaries such as today, or when you stand before a cenotaph or at the gates of a war cemetery and read the words, 'Their name liveth forevermore,' think of John Metson, of his fortitude, his determination not to be a burden to others, and his cheerful acceptance of the awful situation in which he had been thrust. It is now 75 years since the Kokoda campaign ended. The ranks of those who took part in it are thinning, and sadly, we will soon be gone. During our lifetime, we have told the stories. We have written of the deeds of the giants among men who walked ahead of us and showed the way in those dark days of war. We have tried to keep faith with them and with our people. You have a duty to future generations to preserve the legend of John Metson and people like him, people who, in times of extreme adversity, did not lose heart, but pressed on gallantly and cheerfully towards the goal against all odds, placing the welfare of others above their own, and giving us a national tradition of which we should all feel proud. If this nation continues to uphold their nobleness of spirit, and if each individual endeavours to live up to their example, our people shall be fit." His name is listed on the Roll of Honour on my left, among almost 40,000 Australians who died while serving in the Second World War. His photograph is on display today beside the pool of reflection. This is but one of the many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Corporal John Arthur Metson, who gave his life for us and for our freedoms in the hope of a better world.
Please stand for the reading of the ode and the sounding of the last post.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
Present arms.
Lest we forget.
Lest we forget. We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Poziere or in the low scrub at Gallipoli, with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain, has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes this evening's last post ceremony. We do ask for your patience in exiting the commemorative area this evening. Please be mindful of those around you and follow the directions of memorial staff as you make your way to the front entrance. We'd like to thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial and wish you all a very pleasant evening. Thank you.